So as I said, we're looking at chapters 22 through 24, and just to remind us of the context of our studies, we're right on schedule as we hope to be, which is good. Next week we'll be looking at the beginning of the oracles against the nations, and if you look at this outline here, you see that the outline of the book has some introductory discussion and history of the prophet himself as he was by the river Kibar, or a tributary of the Euphrates in Babylon. And then basically oracles against Israel and Judah, including Jerusalem. And it's interesting to think about these because he's speaking in Babylon. But keep in mind that there were people that were around him that were thinking this was a temporary predicament, that they would soon get to go home, because after all, the temple is still standing and God is over his people. This was sort of an aberration from the normal thing, and we'll get to go home. And there were people in Jerusalem, and the majority of people who called themselves prophets at that time were saying just that it was temporary, that they would get to come back home soon. So they were expecting to do that. And Ezekiel is called by God to tell them, no, you're wrong. You're here for the duration. It's going to be a long captivity. And let me explain why it's going to be. And in other words, this is what God called the prophets to do. And the other prophet that was contemporary that we often associate with Ezekiel is Jeremiah. And he was prophesying at the same time as Ezekiel, only his geographical location was back home in Israel, in the environs of the city of Jerusalem. And so after chapter 24, next week we'll look at chapter 25 and start looking at the oracles against the nations. We'll review a little bit about what that means, and in the context of the prophetic literature in general, and in the case of Ezekiel specifically. And then there's going to be, at the end of the book, the message of hope. Even though there's going to be this tribulation and captivity that they have to endure, there is some light at the end of that experience that will allow them not only to go back home, but it will allow them to have a new covenant with a new king, and they'll be called by a new name. And you know all the story about that being in the messianic prophecies concerning Jesus. And so if we look at chapter 22, as I say, we're looking at a couple of specific sections of each of these three chapters. And I've selected some from each chapter to kind of give us an overview and a discussion. And in chapter 22, we have this discussion about the sins of the people. And so just take a look at the first few verses here. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, and you, son of man, will you judge the bloody city? Then declare to her all her abominable deeds. You shall say, thus says the Lord God, a city that sheds blood in the midst of her, that her time may come, that make idols and to defile herself. You have become guilty by the blood which you have shed, and defiled by the idols which you have made. And you have brought your day near, the appointed time of your years has come. Therefore I have made you a reproach to the nations, and a mocking to all the countries. Those that are near and those that are far from you will mock you, you infamous one, full of tumult. So it's interesting that he uses this terminology, the city. And any thoughts on what city he's talking about? Okay, let's make it multiple choice. Is he talking about Nineveh, Babylon, Jerusalem, or Rome? All right, that's easier. Kids at school like multiple choice ones better too. Rather than fill in the blank or something. They sort of complain, I'm unfilled and left blank when I see those kinds of things. But Anyway, it's a lot of fun. Being a teacher's really fun. I enjoy it. I don't get nearly as nervous as the kids do when they're taking a test. So here he is in Babylon, speaking to people who are already captives. And he's talking about Jerusalem way back home. Now, again, keep in mind, their heart is still in Jerusalem. Their heart is wanting to go back there. And they're hoping to go back there soon. And there's messages that have been coming to them. Now, of course, they didn't have cell phones or text messages or these kinds of things, but they had people that would be walking and traveling in different places, going to the markets, and long-time travelers. There would be notes, there would be carry mail, the different kinds of things, but mainly oral messages speaking to each other. And yeah, there's these prophets over in Jerusalem that are predicting that this captivity is going to end and Nebuchadnezzar is going to be overthrown and you people get to come home. And they're wanting to hear that message. That is something they want to hear, and they're going to hold on to it. They're going to spread it around. They're going to talk about it when they're cooking their food and when they're gathering water, when they're washing their clothes, when they're doing all these other things, so that they can, have conversation about the hope that they're expecting to. And Ezekiel, on the other hand, is sort of putting a negative spin on all this, just like Jeremiah was back in Jerusalem. And the people didn't appreciate it at all. God said, I'm sending you among a stiff-necked and uncircumcised people. I'm going to make your forehead hard because they're going to fight against you. And so that's the city he's talking about, is Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will fall. Now, there were 3 deportations with the Babylonians. The first one happened when Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne in 605 BC. And then in 597, he came to Jerusalem and took some of the nobles and the young men and Jehoiakim, king over Judah, into Babylonian captivity. And a prophet by the name of Ezekiel was along with a ride with those people and many others. And that's the second deportation. And so it's between that period of time and 586 when the final disaster occurs that these words are being presented. And in 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem did, in fact, fall to the Babylonians, and the temple was destroyed and burned, and the walls of the city were burned. And you can go to Israel today. I don't recommend it at the precise moment that we're speaking, but I've been there a few times, and several of you have as well. You know that there's places where you can see the lower edges of the original wall of the city of Jerusalem with black burnt marks around it, where the wood that was next to it had just been totally burned up. And so this is what is going to take place because of the sins. And the issue here is because of the deeds and the idols. I mean, look at verse 3 there. A city that sheds blood in the middle of her. Okay, so there was murdering going on. There was deceit and crime that was taking place by people who should have known better. In addition to that, there was this idolatry that was persistent throughout the land, which was really the number one sin of the Old Testament. Remember the first commandment? God gave them 10 commandments, the Decalogue. We read about that in the book of Exodus, chapter 20. It's repeated for the second time in Deuteronomy, chapter 5. And, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He's reminding them of who he is. And he says, you shall have no other gods before me. And of course, the second commandment, you shall not make any graven image of anything that looks like something in the sky or the earth or beneath the earth. And of course, those are the things that the people in the world did. They made images of cats and bulls and eagles and different types of things. And they were to stay away from that stuff. And throughout their history, even before Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, remember the people that were collecting their gold and their jewelry, and Aaron was fashioning a golden calf? I mean, it wasn't very long at all before they started to do this. And so throughout their history, it's a matter of going into that Canaanite cultic, religious, syncretistic worship, that they were supposed to get rid of that and only be worshiping Yahweh, the Lord. And they didn't do it. And that's what this is reminding. And God says, I've had enough of this, and there's going to be punishment. We read about this in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and Leviticus chapter 26, where there were blessings for the people that were promised if they were obedient. And on the other hand, there were curses that would be plunged upon them if they were disobedient. It was their choice. Are you going to get the blessings, or are you going to get the curses? And it was all up to them. They were going to decide if they were going to be obedient to God or not. And the end result was that they persistently and consistently chose the evil. And now they're getting the result. Blessings or curses. They decided they wanted curses. Yes, sir?
There's a couple things that are really interesting to me about the way that all this is listed. First is you have like defiling of innocent blood, you've got idolatry, but then he includes like you mistreated the foreigner amongst you. Or like just last class we talked about how they were making their money out of interest. And you're like, wait a second, that doesn't seem as big of a deal to the others. But the whole point is that they defiled God and made idols. Because of that, they've lost their morality, and they've lost touch with what God wanted them to be. And fundamental to the law is the way that you respect God and the way you treat your fellow humans. And across the board, at every level of their society, they've broken that, which is interesting, the connection between the idolatry and the morality.
Yes.
They've lost that.
Well, when you get to some of the specific things of child sacrifice, for example, I mean, that gets to being, talk about shedding of innocent blood. God says over and over again that you did these things and I did not command you to do it, and it never even entered in my mind for you to do this. I mean, the expressions of this are, I didn't even think about it. I told you what you needed to do and you needed to follow it. And when they don't listen to God, then everything breaks loose. Even exorbitant interest on loans, even not helping the widow or the fatherless, the orphan children, not helping what you need to do for them. And then the other extreme of idolatry and worshiping other gods and sacrificing children to those other gods like Chemosh. I mean, it's horrible to think about that. And that's what they were doing. In verse 6, behold, the princes of Israel in you, everyone according to his power, has been bent on shedding blood. Keep in mind, by the way, what Ahab and Jezebel did to Naboth when he wanted that vineyard, right? Father and mother are treated with contempt in you, and the sojourner suffers extortion in your midst. It's interesting that when you're traveling, you're very vulnerable, and people could take advantage of you. Think about if you have car trouble, and you're far away from home, and you don't have a convenient time to take care of it. If you're in a vulnerable position, people have the opportunity to take advantage of you. Well, of course, they didn't have cars back in Israel in that time, but they had people that were traveling, and people could be taken advantage of because of, and they were willing to do that. They took that opportunity to take advantage. The fatherless and the widow are wronged in you. He doesn't give us specifics here, but when we look at the total teaching of Scripture, we realize that these vulnerable members of society were supposed to be taken care of and looked out after from the other people who were more blessed. Most prominently within the case of orphans, to bring them into your own home. And there's a great discussion that we can have on that discussion in the sense of churches of Christ creating orphans' homes and things of that nature that that took place a lot in the middle of the 20th century and still with us today. You have despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths. There are men in you who slander to shed blood, and men in you who eat upon the mountains. I mentioned what that was last week. It's not going for a picnic on the mountainside. No, this was idolatrous worship practices. That's what they were doing. This is a single example of the type of practice they were using to worship other gods that weren't gods at all. Men commit lewdness in your midst. In you men uncover their fathers' nakedness. In you they humble women who are unclean in their impurity. One commits abomination with his neighbor's wife. This is just a way to talk about adultery. Another lewdly defiles his daughter-in-law. Imagine that type of incest going on in your family. Another in you defiles his sister, his father's daughter. Could be full sister, could be half sister. We see examples of this even in David's own family when we read the story of Samuel and Kings. In you men take bribes to shed blood. You take interest and increase and make gain of your neighbors by extortion, and you have forgotten me, says the Lord God. So yes, as Jason is talking about, these kinds of sins like getting interest, exorbitant interest, may not seem at the same level as murder or idolatry, but it all happens because they're not concerned with remembering God and what God has told them. And so, yeah, you can have small, any sin separates us from God. So if that was just a small sin, well, if that's unrepented of, that separates you from God. And, you and I might make our decision as to what's small and what's big, but ultimately, God is the one who tells us what to do, and there's nothing small when it separates us from God. It's like a pass-fail option. If you don't have redemption, you're gone, you're lost. So we need the redemption that is found in Christ Jesus. Paul talks about this in Romans 7, where he focuses on this tendency to sin. He does know what is right, but he tends to do what is wrong. He wants to do what is right, but his fleshly body insists on doing what is wrong. Wretched man that I'm in. Who can save me from this wretched condition? And of course, the good news is Jesus Christ can do that. And so right now, in the Old Testament period, we only have small glimmers of what that's going to look like. We have to wait until we get the full revelation of God's will through the apostles and prophets of the New Testament, like the Apostle Paul, that wrote those things down and preached on it when he was walking among his brothers and sisters. This is a very graphic, lewd chapter, and I'm not going to read it all. There are times when I've taught Ezekiel at the college level and read some of this, and it was disturbing to people. I understand that. But I ask you, this kind of action, is it not disturbing to God if we're involved in it? Now, what happens in chapter 23 is that we basically have the city of Jerusalem here, and he's talking about what happened in the historical times with the Assyrian captivity, and now what is on the horizon, the Babylonian captivity. And he's using these terms, which Aholah and Aholibah are similar to the Hebrew roots for a tent. So making tents, I don't know what the implication might be with that. Maybe that the people were behaving in such a way that they were going to all kinds of different tents to have relations with people. But what's happening here, well, let's just read this and then I'll give some explanation. The word of the Lord came to me, son of man, this is Ben Adam. There were two women, the daughters of one mother. They played the whore in Egypt, and they played the whore in their youth, and their breasts were pressed and their virgin bosoms handled. It's even more graphic in the Hebrew. Aholah was the name of the elder, and Aholibah was the name of her sister. They became mine, and they bore sons and daughters. As for their names, Aholah is Samaria, and Aholibah is Jerusalem. So there you have the identification. He's not really talking about any specific women. He's talking about the people of Israel and the capital of that country, Samaria. And then he's talking about the country of Judah and the capital of that country, Jerusalem. And if we look at, just to remind ourselves about the map here, I don't have the Assyrian captivity up here, but if you notice here, between Jerusalem and Damascus, right about this area here would be the city of Samaria, which is in the northern country of Israel. And that country was destroyed by the Assyrians, Sargon, Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib, Tiglath-Pileser III. They made havoc of all of that area, and Sennacherib tried to go down to Jerusalem but was turned back. He wasn't successful in the days of Hezekiah, as you recall. He attempted to do it, but he did not. So the northern empire of Israel is Aholah, and the southern city of Jerusalem is Aholibah. Aholibah saw what happened in the north. So the people of Judah saw what happened to Israel and the capital of Samaria when it was destroyed by the Assyrians in the year 722 BC. They saw that destruction, and they should have learned the lesson from it. Did they? No. That's why he's talking about it. And the sister was even worse, that saw her older sister get this treatment, and she decided to behave in the same way anyway. That's what this chapter is all about. And, I've mentioned enough about it that you'll probably read it this afternoon. I encourage you to do that. But it's not for the small children's classes or even the teenage class in mixed company, I'll tell you that. Chapter 24, we're looking at two things. One is the sins of the people and what's going to happen to them, and something very personal to the prophet Ezekiel himself. And we'll talk about that next. But first, let's look at the beginning part of it. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man. You know this Ben Adam in Hebrew. Write down the name of this day, this very day. The king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. And utter an allegory to the rebellious house, and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, set on the pot, set it on, pour water in it also. Put in the pieces of the flesh, all the good pieces, the thigh, the shoulder, fill it with choice bones. Take the choicest one of the flock, pile the logs under it, boil its pieces, seethe also its bones in it. He's saying that the people are the meat, and the Babylonian captivity is the pot that's going to come and destroy the people. And the whole discussion of the chapter, along with much else in the book of Ezekiel, is the enumeration of the sins that caused this disaster to take place. It is a result of their sins, and most prominently the sin of forgetting about Yahweh, forgetting about his exclusive rights as the God above all gods, for there are no others, and that they should worship him. They did not. Instead, they worshiped all kinds of gods. Once in a while, they also worshiped Yahweh, but they mixed it and was a syncretistic mixing of different religious ideas, which was totally against God's will. I am a jealous God, he said. You shall have no other gods before me. It's sort of like a spouse, husband or wife, that says, I'm exclusive to you. You leave, forsake all others and be true just to me, is the idea. We don't want just occasional affection from our spouse, and that pleases us, and the spouse goes and shares that affection with others. No, we don't want that. We want exclusive relationship, and that's what God wanted. I'm God, you're my people, you worship me. Don't worship Baal and me, or don't worship the Asherah and me, or don't worship Molech and me, just me is the idea. And so I think that's the key message here. And this imagery of this pot boiling on the fire is similar to what Jeremiah saw. And he was saying the same basic message back home in Jerusalem. In fact, this in Jeremiah's vision in chapter 1, it's a boiling pot like this, and it's tilted from the north. Throughout the book of Jeremiah, there's this information about problem or something from the north, and it's not until about the middle of the book where he identifies who that is, who that enemy is that's coming from the north, and it's Babylon. They're going to come. And that's what he uses the same imagery here to speak about the disaster that would befall them because of their sins. Yes, sir, Jason.
It's amazing. You read through these chapters, and if you read them back to back, it's more and more depressing, right? You just reference chapter 23. You'll get chapter 16, which is also pretty horrifying. But there's like a little bit of sadness in chapter 16 that's not even there in chapter 23. Like the sadness is gone, it's just horror. And Ezekiel's escalating his language as he goes, because as judgment gets closer, the people need to understand more and more that there's an inevitability about this that you can't be saved. The bloody city, Jerusalem's going to fall. Don't look and think you're going to be saved. Don't think you're getting out of this. This is what's happening. Even in chapter 20, he references that they were idolaters even in Egypt. And this is who they are. He's redefining for the people who they've always been and the need for this judgment so that they can be changed. And so he uses as graphic and clear language as he can to drive the point home. You have to be cooked in a pot. You have to be melted away like the dross in a furnace. You have to be completely destroyed because of what you've done, which is then the context for the latter part of the outline of the book. But he hammers it so hard that they have to understand fully and clearly that this is inevitable, this is what they deserve, and this is who they've always been, which is pretty harsh.
It is very harsh.
But necessary.
Ian? That's right. Yeah, I think that Jason is right to talk about this as an escalation of language. And when you get to 23 and 24, this language is pretty crystal clear about what's happened. And the attitude of the people when they were in Egypt as slaves, and they were offered the opportunity of their freedom to leave, they were still looking back like, oh, we had leeks and onions and meat, and we loved that. And wait a minute, you were hating that life as slaves. And, you want meat? Okay, so God gave them, quail as it was coming out of their nostrils because of that. And then God didn't appreciate that that attitude of their hearts. And so they were slaves in Egypt, and now they're going to be slaves in Babylon. You love the Babylonians. You love to show, Hezekiah showed his whole court to them and all the pride that he had. And they were looking, they weren't looking at it and saying, oh, you have some nice stuff here. No, they said, we're about to get some nice stuff here. Yeah.
Someone might say, well, he's talking to people who are Catholic. Why would he be telling them this? And it seems to be because they're still holding out hope that somehow Jerusalem can be spared.
Yes, that's exactly right.
God's removed his glory from it. Indeed, it's kind of like, we've probably all seen movies about prison camps during World War II. And the prisoners were wondering, how long are we going to be here?
Yeah, I've been to Oświęcim. In Polish, it's called Oświęcim. In German, it's called Auschwitz. And you see that these prisoners that were in bunks, upper bunks, they're close to the ceiling, their head's not a few inches away from the ceiling, and they're writing in chalk their names and scriptures and hoping for God, and they're there. They're wasting away. Their bodies are decaying. They're very skinny and thin. You've seen Schindler's List, right? Isaiah was walking around naked for 3 years, and people were saying, why? Well, because you're going to be walking naked all the way to Nineveh. Get the point? Get the point. And we see these movies, and of course, there's nothing provocative in these images. It's simply human people wasting away and being utterly humiliated by the Germans during the Second World War. And the women are bald. Of course, they've removed their hair. They're now in the linings of the officers' coats in Germany. And so this is what's happening. So here, as Matt was saying, well, why is he saying this to people that are already there in captivity? Well, because they expect to leave soon. And Jeremiah sends messages to them over there. He says, you people that are over there, stay there and make yourself comfortable because you're going to be there for 70 years. Get married. Have your children get married. Build houses. Plant gardens. You're going to be there a long time. This is the idea. And so Ezekiel's counterpart, these two books really kind of go together, and that's what we're seeing here as we look at this. Now, what's interesting here in chapter 24 is that God tells Ezekiel that his wife's about to die. He has that heads up of what's about to happen. And he tells him, you're not going to mourn for her. You're not going to go through the typical routine that a spouse normally does who's mourning the death of a spouse. You're not going to do that. And when people come and bring food to you after she dies, and you're not going to eat that. And you're not going to do any of the things that people are expecting you to do. And that's going to be an obvious anomaly. And people are going to say, hey, Ezekiel, what's up? Why are you behaving like this? And like every time else that the people are asking the prophets those kinds of things. Like, hey, Jeremiah, why are you wearing this yoke on your shoulders? Why did you just smash that flask? Why did you go bury your underwear in Babylon or near the Euphrates? I'm glad you asked. Here's the reason why. The prophets themselves were the visual images of God's message. They didn't use PowerPoint or blackboards or whiteboards or signs or, they themselves were the illustration. And that happens here in this case with Ezekiel's wife. So it tells us here, if we look at the words here, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, Ben Adam, right? Behold, I am about to take the delight of your eyes away from you at a stroke. Yet you shall not mourn or weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh, but not aloud. In other words, it's okay for you to feel sad. Just don't show it. Sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban and put on your shoes on your feet. Do not cover your lips, nor eat the bread of mourners. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. And the next morning I did as I was commanded. Rather simple. Now, think about what this meant to him. It had to be very harsh. Here he is in captivity, and the one thing that probably is motivating him to continue existing is his relationship with his wife, his beautiful wife, the apple of his eye. And God says, I'm taking her. Now, what this means as we continue reading is that the people, the apple of the people's eye was the temple. The temple in the city of Jerusalem that was still standing but about to come down. And God is using Ezekiel and Mrs. Ezekiel as an example of what's about to happen to the people when they're, just like Matt was talking about with why is this message to the people in captivity? It was because they still had a hope. They still had a longing to go back home, and the temple was still standing. Everything was like, it's going to be just a matter of time we get to go home. And then all of a sudden that temple is destroyed. Now, if you think about I mentioned some movies and so forth. If you think back on types of destruction and so forth, if the country's under siege, there's all kinds of things happening, maybe outer space invaders, who knows what. But if the White House and the capital of Washington, D.C. were to be destroyed, then that would be like, excuse me, that'd be like, oh, that's the heart of us. As long as those are standing and visible and we can see that flag waving, there's hope, right? What if that's crushed and destroyed? Now the hope is gone. And what is happening here is that God is using Ezekiel and his relationship with the response to his wife's demise as an illustration of what the people are about to experience. And so they needed to understand that. And so, if you look at verse 19 here, the people said to me, will you not tell us what these things mean for us, that you're acting like this? And then I said to them, the word of the Lord came to me. Say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the pride of your power, the delight of your eyes, and the desire of your soul, and your sons and your daughters whom you left behind shall fall by the sword. See, not only was the temple standing, they had family back in Jerusalem. That was something to look forward to endure the pain here in our own situation, our dire straits, because we're going to get to go home soon. The temple's still standing. We'll get to be home with family and friends, sons and daughters. And God is saying to them, nope, they're going to die. Jeremiah's message in chapter 15 was that you have three choices: sword, famine, or disease, pestilence. And if you survive those three, then you get to go to captivity. So there are four choices, and those are the only ones you've got. So people that were with Ezekiel and the captives in the tributary Kivar were going to get company soon. They weren't going to go home. But some of the people that were home were going to join them in captivity, and the temple, and news of the destruction of the temple would arrive. Keep in mind that this is the utter devastation that is the background to chapter 37. It's like a valley full of dry bones. is there any possible hope left for those bones? Stay tuned. We'll talk about that later. All right. So we saw in this particular chapters 22, the utter sins of the people, big sins, small sins, extortion, bribery, high interest rates. I think about credit card statements when I see this kind of thing, 30%, 24%, and all those things. And then we get into chapter 23, very graphic language that describes how God feels with the people's sins. And then even in chapter 24, the extent of, think about what these prophets had to endure. In the case of Jeremiah, he says, don't get married. In the case of Ezekiel, he says, your wife's going to die. In the case of Isaiah, he says, your wife is going to be a sign with you. In the case of Hosea, oh yeah, I want you to marry a certain kind of a woman. These prophets had to do some very weird things, don't you think? All right, we'll continue next week. Thank you.